In January 1942, a month after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the Second World War. In response, the American Army sent bombers to attack Japan, with one of them crossing the Pacific Ocean. On the plane are pilot Harold Dixon, bomber Tony Postula and radio operator Gene Aldrich. During the trip, Tony informs them that they are heading east, but their target is in the west and they need to return to base. The problem is that the plane is running out of fuel and Harold tells the operator to contact the military command center. While trying to do so, Gene notices that the radio system is picking up Japanese voices, indicating that the call is being traced. He then tries to make contact by Morse code, but can't because the plane is too far from the base. With no other choice, the pilot tells him he's going to make an emergency landing and the plane crashes into the sea, damaging its hull and injuring Tony's nose. Despite this, all three are fine and Harold quickly throws the lifeboat into the sea before the plane sinks. However, Tony is unable to undo his belt and is pulled under, but with a lot of effort, he breaks free and uses his vest to climb to the surface. More problems arise when they try to inflate the dinghy, but it ends up capsizing. Tony then has the idea of using the vests to tie them to the other side of the dinghy and pull it in the right direction, and Gene agrees, but tells his friend to be careful when taking off the vest, as he can't swim. Finally, the three follow the plan and manage to turn the dinghy around, which, although tiny for 3 people, is now their best chance of survival. The next morning, the first day of waiting for rescue begins, with Harold asking Gene and Tony to position themselves at each end of the dinghy. The idea is for the three of them to be able to cover all possible directions in case an American plane appears. Hours pass and finally, Harold sees an object moving in the sky and believes it to be an American fighter jet, sent to rescue them. He then asks for the parachute to be deployed so that the pilot can see them more easily, but it has sunk along with the rest of the equipment. The three of them then take off their coats and swing it in the air, hoping that the pilot will see them, but it's no use and the plane takes off. Tony tries to be optimistic, saying that other planes will come, but Harold knows that won't happen. According to Army protocol, they send a ship to check the crash area, but if there are no signs of survivors, they call off the search and return to base. The pilot also says that the plane didn't get any closer, as the three must now be in enemy waters. As a result, the Army declares them lost at sea, which means that from that moment on, the three can only count on their own luck. Faced with this critical moment, Harold decides to take control of the situation, assuming the post of captain. As his first command, he orders Gene and Tony to show him all the equipment available. Unfortunately, the map of the region, drinking water and food ended up inside the plane. So the three of them take a pocket knife and pistol ammunition out of their pockets and, inside the dinghy, they find rope and wire, glue, a reflecting mirror, 2 life jackets and a canteen of water. Finally, they find around the dinghy its date of manufacture, showing that it was made 4 years ago, and a rope, measuring 7 meters. Fearing that the fabric of the dinghy will wear out quickly, Harold tells them to get rid of their shoes and throw them into the sea. Tony also realizes that his pistol is still in its holster and decides to keep it in case of emergency. With all the equipment they have, the three of them try to pass the time by talking about their lives and how they ended up in the Army. When night falls, Harold suggests alternating surveillance, with Gene going first, while Tony and the pilot rest for a few hours. Following this routine, the trio watch the skies in search of a rescue plane, but the day dawns and there is no sign of them nearby. As soon as Harold wakes up, he uses his meter to get an estimate of where they ended up. According to his recollection of the map, they ended up just over 1,000 miles from Hawaii and, if they keep heading east, they could find the so-called Cook Islands. However, according to calculations, it will take them around 2 or 3 weeks to get there. Gene doesn't think they'll last that long and, even if they reach the islands, they could be taken over by the Japanese Army. The pilot then says that the best thing to do is to catch some fish so that they can endure the journey. Using the rope they found in the bag and the spring inside the ammunition cartridge, they set up a fishing line and throw it into the water, hoping that some fish will take the bait. In a few seconds, the rope begins to be pulled, but it is soon snapped, indicating that a large, aggressive fish is circling the area. Again, they throw the hook out to sea, but hours pass and no other fish appear. Unable to wait, Gene inflates his life jacket and jumps into the water to cool down after being in the sun for so long. Tony decides to do the same, but Harold stops him for fear that they will become live bait if a shark shows up. When he hears this, he warns Gene, who starts swimming desperately back to the dinghy. Fortunately, no sharks appear, but they are still without food and there is no sign of dry land anywhere. Another day passes, with Tony and Gene chatting about school stories, but Harold is running out of patience and interrupts them. He asks Tony about the information he passed on about them going east, not west as the pilot had predicted. Harold finds this strange, but Gene defends his friend, saying that he only passed on the information he received by radio. The situation inside the dinghy becomes increasingly tense and, on the 5th day at sea, they have run out of strength due to the lack of food and water. In an act of desperation, Tony grabs some seawater to drink, but Harold stops him because he knows it will only make him more dehydrated. The young man then asks how they've managed to survive all this time, and the pilot replies that it's thanks to the humidity and low energy expenditure. Even so, they can't wait much longer, and Gene fears that, without a map, there's no way of knowing for sure how far it is to the island. At that moment, Harold remembers the pencil he usually carries in his shirt pocket and, with it, the pilot draws a map, using one of the life jackets. Based on the latest coordinates from the plane, he realizes that the dinghy is close to a sea current, which could take them further from enemy territory. To do so, they need a favorable wind, and Harold asks Gene to remove the rope around the dinghy. He then tells Tony to use the wires to create a frame that is strong enough to withstand the movement of the water. Finally, they attach the wire to one of the vests and Harold throws it into the water, creating a makeshift anchor. With this, they prevent the boat from moving in another direction and can keep the course always to the east. When the wind is favorable, simply remove the anchor and let the boat move normally. More hours pass and Gene decides to say a prayer and invites Tony and Harold to join in. He asks God to help them hold out until they reach dry land and, above all, for the Lord to bring them rain so that they can drink some water. After the prayer, the three begin to sing in the middle of the sea, in an attempt to make the atmosphere a little less tedious. However, as soon as the three fall silent, they have a shock of reality when they realize that they are still adrift at sea, with no sign of a rescue plane or an island nearby. At nightfall, Tony has a nightmare in which he is drowning in the middle of the sea. He soon wakes up and, to his relief, is still in the dinghy and begins to feel raindrops falling on his face. Within seconds, a heavy downpour begins and the three of them quickly drink as much water as possible. They also keep some in their canteens as a reserve, renewing their hopes of surviving the long journey. The day dawns once again and Gene tries to hook a fish, but none of his attempts work. He then tries another way of catching them and, using his knife, begins to strike the water in the hope of hitting a fish. Suddenly, Gene feels that the blade has pierced something hard and suspects that it has hit the boat. However, to everyone's surprise, when he pulls his arm up, a shark jumps into the boat. In one swift movement, Tony holds the huge fish and Gene takes the opportunity to stab it several times. With the shark eliminated, the three cut open its skin and find smaller fish inside its stomach, indicating that the predator had fed just a few minutes before. Thanks to this, the three of them are not only able to eat and regain their energy, but they have also obtained bait and a reserve of food for a few more days. After the meal, they continue chatting, while cleaning up all the shark's blood that has splattered on the dinghy. In the course of the conversation, Harold tells him that he has a wife, but he's been absent since he was drafted into the army. Gene says he still hasn't found someone to marry, but Tony promises to introduce him to his sister, Frances, as soon as they return to the States. Gene is anxious about this and asks Tony to tell him more about her, while he tries to put together an image of the young woman in his mind. Despite this moment of relaxation, the trio suspect something is wrong and, when they look out to sea, they find a group of sharks surrounding the dinghy. Because of this, they need to stay out of the water as much as possible, or they will become the next prey. In the middle of the night, Gene wakes up and tries to clean his face with the seawater, but ends up forgetting about the sharks and one of them bites his hand. Luckily, he manages to pull it off before his hand is devoured, but the wound was serious and Harold quickly improvises a bandage. The next day, the three of them remain in the boat, eating and drinking just enough to keep their energy up and make their reserves last for as many days as possible. However, more than 10 days have passed and, despite another rainstorm filling the water reserves, the sharks are still patrolling the dinghy. What's more, the wound on Gene's hand is getting worse and he's even starting to hallucinate, seeing an island looming on the horizon. However, Tony says he's just seeing things and asks his friend to try and get some rest. With all these setbacks, the trio reach their 15th day at sea and their food reserves are already depleted. Suddenly, a seagull lands near the boat and Gene promptly asks for Tony's pistol. With a clear shot, he hits the bird, but the shot sends it flying away and into the water. Harold wakes up startled by the sound of the shot, but without hesitation, he jumps into the sea and swims until he catches the bird. He then heads back to the dinghy, but Gene and Tony see a huge fin approaching the pilot. They shout for the pilot to swim as fast as possible and Gene tries to shoot the shark, but the gun is out of bullets. Harold continues towards the dinghy, seagull in hand, and just as he was about to be devoured by the predator, Gene and Tony manage to pull him back at the last second. With everyone in the dinghy, they spot the huge predator, which turns out to be a great white shark. Once again, the three of them have to stay out of the water the whole time, but at least they've got some more food to recharge their batteries. As they finish their meal, Tony holds the pistol in his hand, containing only 3 bullets. He was saving it in case they didn't make it to the island, but changed his mind and threw the ammunition into the sea. At dusk, it's Gene's turn to keep watch and he sees the white shark's fin disappearing into the water. He deduces that the predator has given up on its prey and left, with the trio having one less problem to worry about. Even so, they are still at sea, without enough food or water, and the island seems to be getting further and further away. Harold continues to sleep and dreams of the day of the fateful incident with the plane, but this time, he finds himself completely alone inside the cabin. The pilot wakes up startled and is furious to realize that Gene and Tony are also asleep, with no one keeping watch on the boat. He accuses them of disobeying a direct order from a superior and that, with no one awake to drop the anchor, they may have been taken in the wrong direction. Gene doesn't care, because they haven't felt the wind blow for 2 days now and all this effort is being wasted. Harold insists that they are following the route, because before the plane trip, the pilot had memorized every detail of the map in the command center. However, Gene doesn't believe that this will do any good, as the pilot is relying on estimates to pinpoint the location of the island. Finally, he accuses Harold of being responsible for the fact that they went so far off course that they were unable to contact the base. The pilot tries to argue, but he himself realizes that his assumptions have not been confirmed. According to his calculations, the 3 of them would have found the Cook Islands in about 15 to 18 days, but 20 days have passed since the plane crashed and there is no sign of land. This only makes Gene even angrier and he once again questions the pilot about why they took a different route. Amidst the confusion in his mind, Harold once again remembers the plane trip. During the flight, Gene tried to contact the pilot, informing him that they were out of contact with the base. Harold didn't get back to him soon enough, so he remembers that, during the flight, he fell asleep for a few minutes. Because of this carelessness, the plane flew aimlessly for long enough to change course and cause this whole situation. Ashamed to realize the tragic reality, the pilot apologizes to his 2 colleagues for the mistake that could have condemned them to certain elimination. Despite his rebellion, Gene tells them that their only hope is the map drawn by Harold and that they must stick to the route to the end. Upon hearing this, the captain feels motivated again and asks to borrow Gene's pocketknife. With it, the pilot cuts off his pair of shoes and uses the soles as a makeshift oar. Thanks to this resource, the 3 of them take it in turns to push the dinghy a little faster across the sea, hoping to find the island as quickly as possible. However, they have been out on the high seas for a month and still can't see any land around them. The 3 of them have run out of steam, but Harold insists that they must use every last drop of energy to survive. Even so, Gene fears that the end of his life is near and asks the pilot if his family will be entitled to life insurance. Tony asks the same question and Harold says that, as they were marked as lost at sea, the army considers them perished and the money is passed on to their families. This relieves Tony a little, but he regrets not being able to go home and pursue his favorite hobby, which is writing poems. Harold then asks the young man to recite one of his poems, but Tony is too weak and falls asleep. Later, the weather begins to cool down and the trio sense that the rain is coming. Again, they follow the procedure of drinking as much water as possible and keeping a reserve in the canteen, but this time, the storm begins to intensify rapidly. Before long, the whole sky is covered in dark clouds and lightning starts to strike. Harold then tells Gene to hold out as long as possible and hands Tony his life jacket to make sure he doesn't drown if the dinghy sinks. The storm grows stronger and a huge wave approaches the group. The 3 of them hold on as long as they can, but the boat ends up capsizing and they are thrown straight into the sea. Gene and Harold manage to swim out, but they can't find Tony anywhere. Fearing the worst, they call his name until they find the young soldier, who has managed to hang on to the dinghy at the last minute. With the 3 of them reunited, they make a concerted effort to turn the dinghy around and soon manage to climb back into it. Despite the scare, Tony, Gene and Harold survive for another night and, as soon as the storm passes, they try to get some rest. Tony is once again surprised to realize that the 3 of them have managed to survive, despite all the adversities. Harold and Gene think the same thing and ask each other what motivates them to stay alive in that situation. Harold once again talks about his wife and their good times together, but all the physical and mental fatigue prevents him from remembering her face. As for Gene, he remembers the image he created of Frances and promises Tony that he will marry her if they survive. Faced with the hope of his comrades, Harold cries and apologizes once again for his mistake. In addition, he promises to nominate them for decorations in the army, as well as confessing what he has done to the court-martial, but Gene and Tony forgive him for this and say that the important thing now is to stay alive. Finally, Tony stands up once again and, despite having lost the soles of his shoes in the storm, he tries to push the dinghy using his hands. Harold and Jean do the same and continue to make their way through the sea, in an endless struggle for survival. After 4 days of hard work, Harold wakes up and realizes that Tony isn't moving. The pilot tries to call out to the young soldier, but he continues to stare, as if he were already lifeless. When he realizes this, Jean laments his friend's perishment, but in fact Tony is still alive and was just too weak to respond. The young man says he was thinking of a song and begins to sing it, to forget all the pain, tiredness and suffering the three of them are going through. However, at that same moment, Harold is already giving up on everything and takes a sip of seawater. Meanwhile, for the first time since the plane crash, Jean sees a green spot on the horizon and realizes that they have finally found an island. Unlike the hallucination of the day before, Harold and Tony confirm that he told the truth. In celebration, the pilot shouts with all his might, promising to buy dinner for the three of them as soon as they arrive on the island. So, with their will to live renewed, Harold, Jean and Tony use up all their energy to reach the island. As soon as they find the shore, a wave capsizes the boat and the current pushes the three survivors to dry land. When they get there, they find 2 tents set up on the sand and go to ask for help, after spending 34 days on the high seas. It is then revealed that this incredible story of survival was real and the three arrived on Puka Puka Island, after traveling more than 1,000 miles by sea. Shortly afterwards, they returned to the United States and pilot Harold Dixon was decorated for his leadership role throughout those days. Tony Postula, however, was unable to continue in the army due to his injuries and, years later, he perished of natural causes and his ashes were scattered at sea. As for Gene Aldrich, he kept his promise to his friend and married Frances, continuing his military career until the end of the war. Even though they didn't go to the battlefield, Harold, Tony and Gene heroically faced one of the most difficult battles for any human being, the fight for survival. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.